This is part 3 of Psych for Psychology's reading of Psychology, the book by William James. Chapter 7. The Structure of the Brain. Embryological Sketch. The brain is a sort of punsus enorme in anatomy until one gets a certain general conception of it as a clue. Then it becomes a comparatively simple affair. The clue is given by comparative anatomy and especially by embryology. A certain moment in the development of all the higher vertebrates, the cerebrospinal axis is formed by a hollow tube containing fluid and terminated in front by an enlargement separated by transverse constrictions into 3 cerebral vesicles, so called. The walls of these vesicles thicken in most places, change in others into a thin vascular tissue, and in others again send out processes which produce an appearance of farther subdivision. The middle vesicle, or midbrain, and being the figures, is the least affected by change. Its upper walls thicken into the optic lobes, or corpora quadragina, as they are named in man. Its lower walls become so-called peduncles or crura of the brain, and its cavity dwindles into the aqueducta sylvius. The anterior and posterior vesicles undergo much more considerable change. The walls of the posterior vesicle thicken enormously in their foremost portion and form the cerebellum on top and the pons varolei below. In its hindmost portions the posterior vesicle thickens below into the medulla oblongata, whilst on top its walls thin out and melt, so that one can pass a probe into the cavity without breaking through any truly nervous tissue. Cavity which one thus enters from without is named the fourth ventricle. One can run the probe forward through it, passing first under the cerebellum and then under a thin sheet of nervous tissue, the valva viescens, just anterior thereto, as far as the aqueductus sylvius. Passing through this, the probe emerges forward into what was once the cavity of the anterior vesicle, but the covering has melted away at this place, and the cavity now forms a deep compressed pit, grooved between the 2 walls of the vesicle, and is called the third ventricle. The aqueductus sylvius is in consequence of this connection often called the iter, tertia ad quartum ventriculum. The walls of the vesicle form the optic thalami in all the figures. From the anterior vesicle just in front of the thalami there buds out on either side an enlargement, into which the cavity of the vesicle continues, and which becomes the hemisphere of that side. In man its walls thicken enormously and form folds, the so-called convolutions, on their surface. At the same time they grow backwards rather than forwards of their starting point just in front of the thalamus, arching over the latter, and growing fastest along their top circumference. They end by bending downwards and forwards again when they have passed the rear end of the thalamus. When fully developed in man, they overlay and cover in all the other parts of the brain. Their cavities form the lateral ventricles, easier to understand by a dissection than by a description. A probe can be passed into either of them from the third ventricle at its anterior end, and like the third ventricle, their wall is melted down along a certain line, forming a long cleft through which they can be entered without rupturing the nervous tissue. This cleft, on account of the growth of the hemisphere outwards, backwards, and then downwards from its starting point, has got rolled in and tucked away beneath the apparent surface. At first the 2 hemispheres are connected only with their respective thalami, but during the 4th and 5th months of embryonic life they become connected with each other above the thalami through the growth between them of a massive system of transverse fibers which crosses the median line like a great bridge and is called the corpus callosum. These fibers radiate in the walls of both hemispheres and form a direct connection between the convolutions of the right and of the left side. Beneath the corpus callosum another system of fibers called the fornix is formed, between which and the corpus callosum there is a peculiar connection. Just in front of the thalami, where the hemispheres begin their growth, a ganglionic mass called the corpus striatum is formed in their wall. It is complex in structure, consisting of 2 main parts, called nucleus lenticularis and nucleus candatus respectively. The figures, with their respective explanations, will give a better idea of the farther details of structure than any verbal description. So, after some practical directions for dissecting the organ, I will pass to a brief account of the physiological relations of its different parts to each other. Dissection of sheep's brain. The way really to understand the brain is to dissect it. The brains of mammals differ only in their proportions, and from the sheep's one can learn all that is essential in man's. The student is therefore strongly urged to dissect a sheep's brain. Full directions of the order of procedure are given in the human dissecting books, e.g. Holden's Practical Anatomy, Churchill, Morrell's Student's Manual of Comparative Anatomy and Guide to Dissection, Lomans, and Foster and Langley's Practical Physiology, Macmillan. For the use of classes who cannot procure these books I subjoin a few practical notes. The instruments needed are a small saw, a chisel with a shoulder, and a hammer with a hook on its handle, all three of which form part of the regular medical autopsy kit and can be had of surgical instrument makers. In addition, a scalpel, a pair of scissors, a pair of dissecting forceps, and a silver probe are required. The solitary student can find homemade substitutes for all these things but the forceps, which he ought to buy. The first thing is to get off the skull cap. Make 2 saw cuts through the prominent portion of each condyle, or articular surface bounding the hole at the back of the skull, where the spinal cord enters, and passing forwards to the temples of the animal. And make 2 cuts, one on each side, which cross these and meet in an angle on the frontal bone. By actual trial, one will find the best direction for the saw cuts. It is hard to saw entirely through the skull bone without. In some places also sawing into the brain. Here is where the chisel comes in. One can break by a smart blow on it with the hammer any parts of the skull not quite sawn through. When the skull cap is ready to come off, one will feel it wobble. Insert then the hook under its forward end and pull firmly. The bony skull cap alone will come away, leaving the periosteum of the inner surface adhering to that of the base of the skull, enveloping the brain, and forming the so-called duramater or outer one of its meninges. This duramater should be slit open round the margins, when the brain will be exposed wrapped in its nearest membrane. The pia mater full of blood vessels whose branches penetrate the tissues. The brain in its pia mater should now be carefully eshelled out. Usually it is best to begin at the forward end, turning it up there and gradually working backwards. The olfactory lobes are liable to be torn. They must be careful. Foop from the pits in the base of the skull to which they adhere by the branches which they send through the bone into the nose cavity. It is well to have a little blunt curved instrument expressly for this purpose. Next the optic nerves tie the brain down, and must be cut through close to the chiasma is easiest. After that comes the pituitary body, which is to be left behind. It is attached by a neck, the so-called infundibulum, into the upper part of which the cavity of the third ventricle is prolonged downwards for a short distance. It is best examined fresh. If numbers of brains have to be prepared and kept, I have found a good plan to put them first in a solution of chloride of zinc, just dense enough at first to float them and to leave them for a fortnight or less. This softens the pia mater, which can then be removed in large shreds, after which it is enough to place them in quite weak alcohol to preserve them indefinitely tough, elastic, and in their natural shape, though bleached to uniform white color. Before immersion in the chloride, all the more superficial adhesions of the parts must be broken through to bring the fluid into contact with a maximum of surface. If the brain is used fresh, the pia mater had better be removed carefully in most places with the forceps, scalpel, and scissors. Over the grooves between the cerebellum and hemispheres, and between the cerebellum and medulla oblongata, thin cobwebby moist transparent vestiges of the arachnoid membrane will be found. The subdivisions may now be examined in due order. For the convolutions, blood vessels, and nerves the more special books must be consulted. First, looked at from above, with the deep longitudinal fissure between them, the hemispheres are seen partly overlapping the intricately wrinkled cerebellum, which juts out behind, and covers in turn almost all the medulla oblongata. Drawing the hemispheres apart, the brilliant white corpus callosum is revealed, some half an inch below their surface. There is no median partition in the cerebellum, but a median elevation instead. Looking at the brain from below, one still sees the longitudinal fissure in the median line in front, and on either side of it the olfactory lobes, much larger than in man. And the optic tracts and commissure or chiasma, the infundibulum cut through just behind them, and behind that the single corpus albicans or mammillary, whose function is unknown and which is double in man. Next the crur appear, converging upon the pons as if carrying fibers back from either side. The pons itself succeeds, much less prominent than in man, and finally behind it comes the medulla oblongata, broad and flat and relatively large. The pons looks like a sort of collar uniting the two halves of the cerebellum and surrounding the medulla, whose fibers, by the time they have emerged anteriorly from beneath the collar, have divided into the two crura. The relations are, however, somewhat less simple than what this description may suggest. Now turn forward the cerebellum, pull out the vascular choroid plexuses of the pia, which fill the fourth ventricle, and bring the upper surface of the medulla oblongata into view. The fourth ventricle is a triangular depression terminating in a posterior point called the calamus scriptorius. Here, a very fine probe may pass into the central canal of the spinal cord. The lateral boundary of the ventricle on either side is formed by the wristiform body or column, which runs into the cerebellum, forming its inferior or posterior peduncle on that side. including the calamus scriptorius by their divergence. The posterior columns of the spinal cord continue into the medulla as the fasciculi gracils. These are at first separated from the broad restiform bodies by a slight groove, but this disappears anteriorly, and the slender, rope-like strands soon become outwardly indistinguishable. Turn next to the ventral surface of the medulla and note the anterior pyramids, two roundish cords, one on either side of the slight median groove. The pyramids are crossed and closed over anteriorly by the pons varolii, a broad transverse band which surrounds them like a collar and runs up into the cerebellum on either side, forming its middle peduncles. The pons has a slight median depression, and its posterior edge is formed by the trapezium on either side. The trapezium consists of fibers which, instead of surrounding the pyramid, seem to start from alongside of it. It is not visible in man. The olivary bodies are small eminences on the medulla lying just laterally of the pyramids and below the trapezium. Now cut through the peduncles of the cerebellum, close to their entrance into that organ. They give one surface of section on each side, though they receive contributions from three directions: the posterior and middle portions we have seen. The anterior peduncles pass forward to the corpora quadragmina. The thin white layer of nerve tissue between them and continuous with them is called the valva viescens. It covers part of the canal from the fourth ventricle to the third. The cerebellum being removed, examine it, and cut sections to show the peculiar distribution of white and gray matter, forming an appearance called the arbor vitae in the books. Now bend up the posterior edge of the hemispheres, exposing the corpora quadragmina, of which the anterior pair are dubbed the nates and the posterior the testes, and noticing the pineal gland, small median organ situated just in front of them and probably like the pituitary body, vestige of something useful in premammalian times. The rounded posterior edge of the corpus callosum is visible now passing from one hemisphere to the other. Turn it still farther up, letting the medulla, etc. hang down as much as possible and trace the undersurface from this edge forward. It is broad behind but narrows forward, becoming continuous with the fornix. The anterior stem, so to speak, of this organ plunges down just in front of the optic thalami, which now appear with the fornix arching over them and the median third ventricle between them. The margins of the fornix, as they pass backwards, diverge laterally farther than the margins of the corpus callosum, and under the name of corpora fimbriata are carried into the lateral ventricles, as will be seen again. It takes a good topographical mind to understand these ventricles clearly, even when they are followed with eye and hand. A verbal description is absolutely useless. The essential thing to remember is that they are offshoots from the original cavity, now the third ventricle, of the anterior vesicle, and that a great split has occurred in the walls of the hemispheres so that they, the lateral ventricles, now communicate with the exterior along a cleft which appears sickle-shaped. It were enfolded in. The student will probably examine the relations of the parts in various ways, but he will do well to begin in any case by cutting horizontal slices off the hemispheres almost down to the level of the corpus callosum and examining the distribution of gray and white matter on the surfaces of section, any one of which is the so-called centrum ovale, and let him cut down in a fore and aft direction along the edge of the corpus callosum, till he comes out through and draw the hemispherical margin of the cut outwards. He will see a space which is the ventricle, and which farther cutting along the side and removing of its hemisphere roof will lay more bare. The most conspicuous object on its floor is the nucleus caudatus of the corpus striatum. Cut the corpus callosum transversely through near its posterior edge and bend the anterior portion of it forwards and sideways. The rear edge, splenium, left and situ bends round and downwards and becomes continuous with the fornix. The anterior part is also continuous with the fornix, but more along the median line where a thinnish membrane, the septum lucidum, triangular in shape, reaching from the one body to the other, practically forms a sort of partition between the contiguous portion of the lateral ventricles on the two sides. Break through the septum if need be and expose the upper surface of the fornix, broad behind and narrow in front where its anterior pillars plunge down in front of the third ventricle from a thickening in whose anterior walls they were originally formed, and finally penetrate the corpus albicans. Cut these pillars through and fold them back, exposing the thalamic portion of the brain and noting the undersurface of the fornix. Its diverging posterior pillars run backwards, downwards, and then forwards again, forming with their sharp edges the corpora fimbriata, which bound the cleft by which the ventricle lies open. The semi-cylindrical walls behind the corpora fimbriata and parallel thereto in the wall of the ventricle are the hippocampi. Imagine the fornix and corpus callosum shortened in the fore and aft direction to a transverse cord. Imagine the hemispheres not having grown backwards and downwards round the thalamus, and corpus fimbriatum on either side would then be the upper or anterior margin of A split in the wall of the hemispheric ventricle, which the lower and posterior margin would be the posterior border of the corpus striatum, where it grows out of the thalamus. The little notch is just behind the anterior pillar of the fornix, and between them and the thalami are the so-called foramen of Monro, through which the plexus of vessels, etc., passes from the median to lateral ventricles. See the thick middle commissure joining the two thalami, just as the corpus callosum and fornix join the hemispheres. These are all embryological aftergrowths. Seek also the anterior commissure crossing just in front of the anterior pillars of the fornix, as well as the posterior commissure with its lateral prolongations along the thalami just below the pineal gland. On a median section, note the thinnish anterior wall of the third ventricle and its prolongation downwards into the infundibulum. Turn up or cut off the rear end of one hemisphere so as to see clearly the optic tracts turning upwards towards the rear corner of the thalamus. The corpora geniculata, to which they also go, distinct in man, are less so in the sheep. The lower ones are visible between the optic tract band and the testis, however. The brain's principal parts are thus passed in review. A longitudinal section of the whole organ through the median line will be found most instructive. The student should also, on a fresh brain, or one hardened by chromate of potash or ammonia to save the contrast of color between white and gray matter, make transverse sections through the nates and crura and through the hemispheres just in front of the corpus albicans. The latter section shows on each side the nucleus lenticularis of the corpus striatum and also the inner capsule. When all is said and done, the fact remains that, for the beginner, the understanding of the brain's structure is not an easy thing. It must be gone over and forgotten and learned again many times before it is definitively assimilated by the mind. But patience and repetition, here as elsewhere, will bear their perfect fruit. Chapter 8. The Functions of the Brain. General idea of nervous function. If I begin chopping the foot of a tree, its branches are unmoved by my act, and its leaves murmur as peacefully as ever in the wind. If, on the contrary, I do violence to the foot of a fellow man, the rest of his body instantly responds to the aggression by movements of alarm or defense. The reason of this difference is that the man has a nervous system, whilst the tree has none, and the function of the nervous system is to bring each part into harmonious cooperation with every other. The afferent nerves, when excited by some physical irritant, be this as gross in its mode of operation as chopping axe or as subtle as the waves of light, conveys the excitement to the nervous centers. The commotion set up in the centers does not stop there, but discharges through the efferent nerves, exciting movements which vary with the animal and with the irritant applied. These acts of the response have usually the common character of being of service. They ward off the noxious stimulus and support the beneficial one, whilst if, in itself indifferent, the stimulus be sign of some distant circumstance of practical importance, the animal's acts are addressed to this circumstance so as to avoid its perils or secure its benefits, as the case may be. To take common example, if I hear the conductor calling all aboard, as I enter the station, my heart first stops, then palpitates, and my legs respond to the airwaves falling on my tympanum by quickening their movements. If I stumble as I run, the sensation of falling provokes movement of the hands towards the direction of the fall, the effect of which is to shield the body from too sudden shock. If cinder enter my eye, its lids close forcibly, and copious flow of tears tends to wash it out. These three responses to a sensational stimulus differ, however, in many respects. The closure of the eye and the lacrimation are quite involuntary, and so is the disturbance of the heart. Such involuntary responses we know as reflex acts. The motion of the arms to break the shock of falling may also be called reflex, since it occurs too quickly to be deliberately intended. It is, at any rate, less automatic than the previous acts, for a man might by conscious effort learn to perform it more skillfully or even to suppress it altogether. Actions of this kind, into which instinct and volition enter upon equal terms, have been called a semi-reflex. The act of running towards the train, on the other hand, has no instinctive element about it. It is purely the result of education, and is preceded by a consciousness of the purpose to be attained in, a distinct mandate of the will. It is a voluntary act. Thus the animal's reflex and voluntary performances shade into each other gradually, being connected by acts which may often occur automatically, but may also be modified by conscious intelligence. The frog's nerve centers. Let us now look a little more closely at what goes on. The best way to enter the subject will be to take a lower creature, like a frog, and study by the vivisectional method the functions of his different nerve centers. The frog's nerve centers are figured in the diagram over the page, which needs no further explanation. I shall first proceed to state what happens when various amounts of the anterior parts are removed in different frogs. in the way in which an ordinary student removes them, that is, with no extreme precautions as to the purity of the operation. If then we reduce the frog's nervous system to the spinal cord alone by making a section behind the base of the skull, between the spinal cord and the medulla oblongata, thereby cutting off the brain from all connection with the rest of the body, the frog will still continue to live, but with a very peculiarly modified activity. It ceases to breathe or swallow. It lies flat on its belly and does not, like a normal frog, sit up on its forepaws. Its hind legs are kept, as usual, folded against its body and immediately resume this position if drawn out. If thrown on its back, it lies there quietly, without turning over like a normal frog. Locomotion and voice seem entirely abolished. If we suspend it by the nose and irritate different portions of its skin by acid, it performs a set of remarkable defensive movements calculated to wipe away the irritant. Thus, if the breast be touched, forepaws will rub it vigorously. If we touch the outer side of the elbow, the hind foot of the same side will rise directly to the spot and wipe it. The back of the foot will rub the knee if that be attacked, whilst if the foot be cut away, the stump will make ineffectual movements, and then, in many frogs, a pause will come as if for deliberation, succeeded by a rapid passage of the opposite unmutilated foot to the acidulated spot. The most striking character of all these movements, after their teleological appropriateness, is their precision. The very insensitive frogs, and with a proper amount of irritation, so little as almost to resemble in their machine-like regularity the performances of a jumping jack, whose legs must twitch whenever you pull the string. The spinal cord of the frog thus contains arrangements of cells and fibers fitted to convert skin irritations into movements of defense. We may call it the center for defensive movements in this animal. We may indeed go farther than this, and by cutting the spinal cord in various places find that its separate segments are independent mechanisms for appropriate activities of the head and of the arms and legs respectively. The segment governing the arms is especially active in male frogs in the breeding season, and these members alone, with the breast and back appertaining to them and everything else cut away, will actively grasp a finger placed between them and remain hanging to it for a considerable time. Similarly of the medulla oblongata, optic lobes, and other centers between the spinal cord and the hemispheres of the frog. Each of them is proved by experiment to contain a mechanism for the accurate execution in response to definite stimuli of certain special acts. Thus with the medulla the animal swallows. With the medulla and cerebellum together he jumps, swims, and turns over from his back. With his optic lobes he croaks when pinched, etc. A frog which has lost his cerebral hemispheres alone is, by an unpracticed observer, indistinguishable from a normal animal. Not only is he capable, on proper instigation, of all the acts already mentioned, but he guides himself by sight, so that if an obstacle be set up between him and the light, and he be forced to move forward, he either jumps over it or swerves to one side. He manifests the sexual instinct at the proper seasons, and discriminates between male and female individuals of his own species. He is, in short, so similar in every respect to a normal frog that it would take a person very familiar with these animals to suspect anything wrong or wanting about him. But even then such a person would soon remark the almost entire absence of spontaneous motion, that is, motion unprovoked by any present incitation of sense. The continued movements of swimming, performed by the creature in the water, seem to be the fatal result of the contact of that fluid with its skin. They cease when a stick, for example, touches his hands. This is a sensible irritant towards which the feet are automatically drawn by reflex action, and on which the animal remains sitting. He manifests no hunger, and will suffer. A fly to crawl over his nose and snap that. Fear, too, seems to have deserted him. In a word, he is an extremely complex machine whose actions, so far as they go, tend to self-preservation, but still a machine in the sense that it seems to contain no incalculable element. By applying the right sensory stimulus to him, we are almost as certain of getting fixed responses. An organist is of hearing certain tone when he pulls out certain stop. But now if to the lower centers we add the cerebral hemispheres, or if, in other words, make an intact animal the subject of our observations, all this is changed. In addition to the previous responses to present incitements of sense, our frog now goes through long and complex acts of locomotion spontaneously, or as if moved by what in ourselves we should call an idea. His reactions to outward stimuli vary their form, too. Instead of making simple defensive movements with his hind legs, like headless frog, if touched, or of giving one, two leaps and then sitting still like hemisphereless one, he makes persistent and varied efforts of escape, as if not the mere contact of the physiologist's hand, but the notion of danger suggested by it were now his spur. Led by the feeling of hunger, too, he goes in search of insects, fish, or smaller frogs, and varies his procedure with each species of victim. The physiologist cannot, by manipulating him, elicit croaking, crawling up board, swimming, or thopping at will. His conduct has become incalculable. We can no longer foretell it exactly. Effort to escape is his dominant reaction, but he may do anything else, even swell up and become perfectly passive in our hands. Such are the phenomena commonly observed, and such the impressions which one naturally receives. Certain general conclusions follow irresistibly. First of all, the following. The acts of all the centers involve the use of the same muscles. When a brainless frog's hind leg wipes the acid, he calls into play all the leg muscles which a frog with his full metal oblongata and cerebellum uses when he turns from his back to his belly. Their contractions are, however, combined differently in the two cases, so that the results vary widely. We must consequently conclude that specific arrangements of cells and fibers exist in the cord for wiping, in the medulla for turning over, etc. Similarly, they exist in the thalami for jumping over seen obstacles and for balancing the moved body, in the optic lobes for creeping backwards, or what not. But in the hemispheres, since the presence of these organs brings no new elementary form, the movement with it, but only determines differently the occasions on which the movement shall occur, making the usual stimuli less fatal and machine-like, we need suppose no such machinery directly coordinative of muscular contractions to exist. We may rather assume, when the mandate for wiping movement is sent forth by the hemispheres, that current goes straight to the wiping arrangement in the spinal cord, exciting this arrangement as whole. Similarly, if an intact frog wishes to jump, all he need do is to excite from the hemispheres the jumping center in the thalami or wherever it may be, and the latter will provide for the details of the execution. It is like General ordering Colonel to make certain movement, but not telling him how it shall be done. The same muscle, then, is repeatedly represented at different heights, and at each it enters into different combination with other muscles to cooperate in some special form of concerted movement. At each height the movement is discharged by some particular form of sensorial stimulus, whilst the stimuli which discharge the hemispheres would seem not so much to be elementary sorts of sensation, as groups of sensations forming determinate objects or things. The pigeon's lower centers, the results are just the same if, instead of a frog, we take a pigeon, cut out his hemispheres carefully, and wait till he recovers from the operation. There is not movement natural to him which this brainless bird cannot execute. He seems, too, after some days to execute movements from some inner irritation, for he moves spontaneously. But his emotions and instincts exist no longer. In Schrader's striking words, the hemisphereless animal moves in a world of bodies which are all of equal value for him. He is, to use Galt's apt expression, impersonal. Every object is for him only a space-occupying mass. He turns out of his path for an ordinary pigeon no otherwise than for a stone. He may try to climb over Bo. All authors agree that they never found any difference whether it was an inanimate body, a cat, a dog, or a bird of prey which came in their pigeon's way. The creature knows neither friends nor enemies. In the thickest company it lives like a hermit. The languishing cooing of the male awakens no more impression than the rattling of the peas or the call whistle which in the days before the injury used to make the birds hasten to be fed. Quite as little as the earlier observers have seen hemisphereless she-birds answer the courting of the male. A hemisphereless male will coo all day long and show distinct signs of sexual excitement, but his activity is without any object. It is entirely indifferent to him whether the she-bird be there or not. If one is placed near him, he leaves her unnoticed. As the male pays no attention to the female, so she pays none to her young. The brood may follow the mother ceaselessly calling for food, but they might as well ask it from a stone. The hemisphereless pigeon is in the highest degree tame, and fears man as little as cat or bird of prey. General notion of hemispheres. All these facts lead us, when we try to formulate them broadly, to some such conception as this. The lower centers act from present sensational stimuli alone. The hemispheres act from considerations, the sensations which they may receive serving only as suggestors of these. But what are considerations but expectations, in the fancy, of sensations which will be felt one way or another according as action takes this course or that? If I step aside on seeing a rattlesnake from considering how dangerous an animal he is, the mental materials which constitute my prudential reflection are images more or less vivid of the movement of his head, of a sudden pain in my leg, of a state of terror, a swelling of the limb, a chill, delirium, death, etc., etc., and the ruin of my hopes. But all these images are constructed out of my past experiences. They are reproductions of what I have felt or witnessed. They are, in short, remote sensations, and the main difference between the hemisphereless animal and the whole one may be concisely expressed by saying that the one obeys absent, the other only present, objects. The hemispheres would then seem to be the chief seat of memory. Vestiges of past experience must in some way be stored up in them, and must, when aroused by present stimuli, first appear as representations of distant goods and evils, and then must discharge into the appropriate motor channels for warding off the evil and securing the benefits of the good. If we liken the nervous currents to electric currents, we can compare the nervous system. The hemisphere adds the long circuit or loop line through which the current may pass when for any reason the direct line is not used. Thus, a tired wayfarer on a hot day throws himself on the damp earth beneath a maple tree. The sensations of delicious rest and coolness pouring themselves through the direct line would naturally discharge into the muscles of complete extension. He would abandon himself to the dangerous repose. But the loop line being open, part of the current is drafted along it and awakens rheumatic or cattle reminiscences which prevail over the instigations of sense and make the man arise and pursue his way to where he may enjoy his rest more safely. Presently we shall examine the manner in which the hemispheric loop line may be supposed to serve as a reservoir for such reminiscences as these. Meanwhile I will ask reader to notice some corollaries of its being such a reservoir. First, no animal without it can deliberate pause, postpone, nicely weigh one motive against another, or compare. Prudence, in a word, is for such a creature an impossible virtue. Accordingly, we see that nature removes those functions in the exercise of which prudence is a virtue from the lower centers and hands them over to the cerebrum, wherever a creature has to deal with complex features of environment. Prudence is a virtue. The higher animals have so to deal, and the more complex the features, the higher we call the animals. The fewer of his acts, then, can such an animal perform without the help of the organs in question. In the frog many acts devolve wholly on the lower centers. In the bird fewer, in the rodent fewer still, in the dog very few indeed, and in apes and men hardly any at all. The advantages of this are obvious. Take the prehension of food as an example and suppose it to be a reflex performance of the lower centers. The animal will be condemned fatally and irresistibly to snap at it whenever presented, no matter what the circumstances may be. He can no more disobey this prompting than water can refuse to boil when a fire is kindled under the pot. His life will again and again pay the forfeit of his gluttony. Exposure to retaliation, other enemies, to traps, to poisons, to the dangers of repletion must be regular parts of his existence. His lack of all thought by which to weigh the danger against the attractiveness of the bait, and of all volition to remain hungry. A little while longer is the direct measure of his lowness in the mental scale, and those fishes which, like our cunners and sculpins, are no sooner thrown back from the hook into the water than they automatically seize the hook again, would soon expiate the degradation of their intelligence by the extinction of their type, did not their extraordinary fecundity atone for their imprudence. Appetite and the acts it prompts have consequently become in all higher vertebrates functions of the cerebrum. They disappear when the physiologist's knife has left the subordinate centers alone in place. The brainless pigeon will starve though left on a corn heap. Take again the sexual function. In birds this devolves exclusively upon the hemispheres. When these are shorn away, the pigeon pays no attention to the billings and cooings of its mate. It is the same, according to Goltz, with male dogs who have suffered large losses of cerebral tissue. Those who have read Darwin's Descent of Man will recollect what an importance this author ascribes to the agency of sexual selection in the amelioration of the breeds of birds. The females are naturally coy, and their coyness must be overcome by the exhibition of the gorgeous plumage, and various accomplishments in the way of strutting and fighting of the males. In frogs and toads, on the other hand, where the sexual instinct devolves upon the lower centers, we find machine-like obedience to the present incitements of sense, and an almost total exclusion of the power of choice. The consequence is that every spring an immense waste of butration life, involving numbers of adult animals and innumerable eggs, takes place from no other cause than the blind character of the sexual impulse in these creatures. No one need be told how dependent all human social elevation is upon the prevalence of chastity. Hardly any factor measures more than this the difference between civilization and barbarism. Physiologically interpreted, chastity means nothing more than the fact that present solicitations of sense are overpowered by suggestions of aesthetic and moral fitness which the circumstances awaken in the cerebrum, and that upon the inhibitory or permissive influence of these alone action directly depends. Within the psychic life due to the cerebrum itself the same general distinction obtains between considerations of the more immediate and considerations of the more remote. In all ages the man whose determinations are swayed by reference to the most distant ends has been held to possess the highest intelligence. The tramp who lives from hour to hour, the bohemian whose engagements are from day to day, the bachelor who builds but for a single life, of the father who acts for another generation, the patriot who thinks of a whole community and many generations, and finally the philosopher and saint whose cares are for humanity and for eternity. These range themselves in an unbroken hierarchy, wherein each successive grade results from an increased manifestation of the special form of action by which the cerebral centers are distinguished from all below them. The automaton theory. In the loop line along which the memories and ideas of the distant are supposed to lie, the action, so far as it is a physical process, must be interpreted after the type of the action in the lower centers. If regarded here as a reflex process, it must be reflex there as well. The current in both places runs out into the muscles only after it had first run in, but whilst the path by which it runs out is determined in the lower centers by reflections few and fixed amongst the cell arrangements, in the hemispheres the reflections are many and unstable. This, it will be seen, is only a difference of degree and not a kind, and does not change the reflex type. The conception of all action as conforming to this type is the fundamental conception of modern nerve physiology. This conception now has led to two quite opposite theories about the relation to consciousness of the nervous functions. Some authors, finding that the higher voluntary functions seem to require the guidance of feeling, conclude that over the lowest reflexes some such feeling also presides, though it may be a feeling connected with the spinal cord, of which the higher conscious self connected with the hemispheres remains unconscious. Others, finding that reflex and semi-automatic acts may, notwithstanding their appropriateness, take place with an unconsciousness apparently complete, fly to the opposite extreme and maintain that the appropriateness even of the higher voluntary actions connected with the hemispheres owes nothing to the fact that consciousness attends them. They are, according to these writers, results of physiological mechanism pure and simple. To comprehend completely this latter doctrine one should apply it to examples. The movements of our tongues and pens, the flashings of our eyes in conversation, are of course events of a physiological order, and as such their causal antecedents may be exclusively mechanical. If we knew thoroughly the nervous system of Shakespeare, and as thoroughly all his environing conditions, we should be able, according to the theory of automatism, to show why at a given period of his life his hand came to trace on certain sheets of paper those crabbed little black marks which we for shortness' sake call the manuscript of Hamlet. We should understand the rationale of every erasure and alteration therein, and we should understand all this without in the slightest degree acknowledging the existence of the thoughts in Shakespeare's mind. The words and sentences would be taken not as signs of anything beyond themselves, but as little outward facts, pure and simple. In like manner, the automaton theory affirms, might exhaustively write the biography of those 200 pounds, more or less, of warmish albuminoid matter called Martin Luther, without ever implying that it felt. But, on the other hand, nothing in all this could prevent us from giving an equally complete account of either Luther's or Shakespeare's spiritual history, an account in which every gleam of thought and emotion should find its place. The mind history would run alongside of the body history of each man, and each point in the one would correspond to, but not react upon, a point in the other. So the melody floats from the harp string, but neither checks nor quickens its vibrations. So the shadow runs alongside the pedestrian, but in no way influences his steps, as a mere conception, and so long as we confine our view to the nervous centers themselves, few things are more seductive than this radically mechanical theory of their action. And yet our consciousness is there, and has in all probability been evolved, like all other functions, for the use it is to the highest degree improbable a priori that it should have no use. Its use seems to be that of selection, but to select it must be efficacious. States of consciousness which feel right are held fast to, those which feel wrong are checked. If the holding and the checking of the conscious states severally mean also the efficacious reinforcing or inhibiting of the correlated neural processes, then it would seem as if the presence of the states of mind might help to steer the nervous system and keep it in the path which to the consciousness seemed best. Now on the average, what seems best to consciousness is really best for the creature. It is a well-known fact that pleasures are generally associated with beneficial, pains with detrimental experiences. All the fundamental vital processes illustrate this law. Starvation, suffocation and privation of food, drink, and sleep, work when exhausted the burns, wounds, inflammation, and the effects of poison are as disagreeable as filling the hungry stomach, enjoying rest and sleep after fatigue, exercise after rest. A sound skin and unbroken bones at all times are pleasant. Mr. Spencer and others have suggested that these coincidences are due not to any pre-established harmony, but to the mere action of natural selection, which would certainly kill off in the long run any breed of creatures to whom the fundamentally noxious experience seemed enjoyable. An animal that should take pleasure in feeling of suffocation would, if that pleasure were efficacious enough to make him keep his head under water, enjoy longevity of 4 or 5 minutes. But if conscious pleasure does not reinforce, and conscious pain does not inhibit anything, one does not see, without some such priori rational harmony as would be scouted by the scientific champions of the automaton theory, why the most noxious acts such as burning might not with perfect impunity give thrills of delight, and the most necessary ones, such as breathing, cause agony. The only considerable attempt has been made to explain the distribution of our feelings is that of Mr. Grant Allen in his suggestive little work, Physiological Aesthetics, and his reasoning is based exclusively on that causal efficacy of pleasures and pains which the partisans of pure automatism so strenuously deny. Probability and circumstantial evidence thus run dead against the theory that our actions are purely mechanical in their causation. From the point of view of descriptive psychology, even though we be bound to assume, as on p. 6, that all our feelings have brain processes for their condition of existence, and can be remotely traced in every instance to currents coming from the outer world, we have no clear reason to doubt that the feelings may react so as to further or to dampen the processes to which they are due. I shall therefore not hesitate in the course of this book to use the language of common sense. I shall talk as if consciousness kept actively pressing the nerve centers in the direction of its own ends, and was no mere impotent and paralytic spectator of life's game. The localization of functions in the hemispheres. The hemispheres, we lately said, must be the organ of memory, and in some way retain vestiges of former currents, by means of which mental considerations drawn from the past may be aroused before action takes place. The vivisections of physiologists and the observations of physicians have of late years given a concrete confirmation to this notion which the first rough appearances suggest. The various convolutions have had special functions assigned to them in relation to this and that sense organ, as well as to this or that portion of the muscular system. This book is no place for going over the evidence in detail, so I will simply indicate the conclusions which are most probable at the date of writing. Mental and cerebral elements. In the first place, there is a very neat parallelism between the analysis of brain functions by the physiologists and that of mental functions by analytic psychologists. The phrenological brain doctrine divided the brain into organs, each of which stood for the man in a certain partial attitude. The organ of philoprogenitiveness, with its concomitant consciousness, is an entire man so far as he loves children, that a reverence is an entire man worshipping, etc. The spiritualistic psychology, in turn, divided the mind into faculties, which were also entire mental men in certain limited attitudes, but faculties are not mental elements any more than organs are brain elements. Analysis breaks both into more elementary constituents. Brain and mind alike consist of simple elements, sensory and motor, all nervous centers. Says Dr. Hewlings Jackson, from the lowest to the very highest, the substrata of consciousness are made up of nothing else than nervous arrangements, representing impressions and movements. I do not see of what other materials the brain can be made. Maynard represents the matter similarly when he calls the cortex of the hemispheres the surface of projection for every muscle and every sensitive point of the body. The muscles and the sensitive points are represented each by a cortical point, and the brain is little more than the sum of all these cortical points, to which, on the mental side, as many sensations and ideas correspond. The sensations, ideas of sensation and emotion are, in turn, the elements out of which the mind is built according to the analytic school of psychology. The relations between objects are explained by associations between the ideas, and the emotional and instinctive tendencies by associations between ideas and movements. The same diagram can symbolize both the inner and the outer world, the dots or circles standing indifferently for cells or ideas, and lines joining them for fibers or associations. The associationist doctrine of ideas may be doubted to be a literal expression of the truth, but it probably will always retain a didactic usefulness. At all events, it is interesting to see how well physiological analysis plays into its hands. To proceed to details. The motor region. The one thing which is perfectly well established is this, that the central convolutions, on either side of the fissure of Rolando, and, at least in the monkey, the callosal marginal convolution, which is continuous with them on the mesal surface where one hemisphere is applied against the other, form the region by which all the motor incitations which leave the cortex pass out on their way to those executive centers in the region of the pons, medulla, spinal cord, from which the muscular contractions are discharged in the last resort. The existence of this so-called motor zone is established by anatomical as well as vivisectional and pathological evidence. All sensory currents entering the hemispheres run out from the Rolandic region, which may thus be regarded as a sort of funnel of escape, which narrows still more as it plunges beneath the surface, traversing the inner capsule, pons, and parts below. The dark ellipses on the left half of the diagram stand for hemorrhages or tumors, and the reader can easily trace, by following the course of the fibers, what the effect of them in interrupting motor currents may be. One of the most instructive proofs of motor localization in the cortex is that furnished by the disease now called aphemia, or motor aphasia. Motor aphasia is neither loss of voice nor paralysis of the tongue or lips. The patient's voice is as strong as ever, and all the innervations of his hypoglossal and facial nerves, except those necessary for speaking, may go on perfectly well. He can laugh and cry, and even sing, but he either is unable to utter any word at all, or a few meaningless stock phrases form his only speech, or else he speaks incoherently and confusedly, mispronouncing, misplacing, and misusing his words in various degrees. Sometimes his speech is a mere broth of unintelligible syllables. In cases of pure motor aphasia, the patient recognizes his mistakes and suffers acutely from them. Now, whenever a patient dies in such a condition as this, and an examination of his brain is permitted, it is found that the lowest frontal gyrus is the seat of injury. Broca first noticed this fact in 1861. Since then the gyrus has gone by the name of Broca's convolution. The injury in right-handed people is found on the left hemisphere, and in left-handed people on the right hemisphere. Most people, in fact, are left-brained, that is, all their delicate and specialized movements are handed over to the charge of the left hemisphere. The ordinary right-handedness for such movements is only a consequence of that fact, a consequence which shows outwardly on account of the extensive crossing of the fibers from the left hemisphere to the right half of the body only, below the letter M. But the left-brainedness might exist and not show outwardly. This would happen wherever organs on both sides of the body could be governed by the left hemisphere, and just such a case seems offered by the vocal organs, in that highly delicate and special motor service which we call speech. Either hemisphere can innervate them bilaterally, just as either seems able to innervate bilaterally the muscles of the trunk, ribs, and diaphragm. Of the special movements of speech, however, it would appear, from these very facts of aphasia, that the left hemisphere in most persons habitually takes exclusive charge. With that hemisphere thrown out of gear, speech is undone, even though the opposite hemisphere still be there for the performance of less specialized acts such as the various movements required in eating. The visual center is in the occipital lobes. This also is proved by all the three kinds of possible evidence. It seems that the fibers from the left halves of both retinae go to the left hemisphere, those from the right half to the right hemisphere. The consequence is that when the right occipital lobe, for example, is injured, hemianopsia results in both eyes. That is, both retinae grow blind as to their right halves, and the patient loses the leftward half of his field of view. Quite recently, both Schieffer and Monk, in studying the movements of the eyeball produced by galvanizing the visual cortex in monkeys and dogs, have found reason to plot out an analogous correspondence between the upper and lower portions of the retinae and certain parts of the visual cortex. If both occipital lobes were destroyed, we should have double hemiopia, or, in other words, total blindness. In human hemiopic blindness there is insensibility. Light on one half of the field of view, but mental images of visible things remain. In double hemiopia there is every reason to believe that not only the sensation of light must go, but that all memories and images of visual order must be annihilated also. A man loses his visual ideas. Only cortical blindness can produce this effect on the ideas. Destruction of the retinae or of the visual tracts anywhere between the cortex and the eyes impairs the retinal sensibility to light, but not the power of visual imagination. Mental blindness. A most interesting effect of cortical disorder is mental blindness. This consists not so much in insensibility to optical impressions as in inability to understand them. Psychologically, it is interpretable as loss of associations between optical sensations and what they signify, and any interruption of the paths between the optic centers and the centers for other ideas ought to bring it about. Thus, printed letters of the alphabet, or words, signify both certain sounds and certain articulatory movements, but the connection between the articulating or auditory centers and those for sight being ruptured, we ought a priori to expect that the sight of words would fail to awaken the idea of their sound, or of the movement for pronouncing them. We ought, in short, to have alexia, or inability to read, and this is just what we do have as a complication of aphasic disease in many cases of extensive injury about the frontotemporal regions. Where an object fails to be recognized by sight, it often happens that the patient will recognize and name it as soon as he touches it with his hand. This shows in an interesting way how numerous are the incoming paths which all end by running out of the brain through the channel of speech. The hand path is open, though the eye path be closed. When mental blindness is most complete, neither sight, touch, nor sound avails to steer it. Patient in a sort of dementia which has been called asymbolic or apraxia is the result. The commonest articles are not understood. The patient will put his breeches on one shoulder and his hat upon the other, will bite into the soap and lay his shoes on the table, or take his food into his hand and throw it down again, not knowing what to do with it, etc. Such disorder can only come from extensive brain injury. The center for hearing is situated in men in the upper convolution of the temporal lobe. The phenomena of aphasia show this. We studied motor aphasia a few pages back. We must now consider sensory aphasia. Our knowledge of aphasia has had 3 stages. We may talk of the period of Broca, the period of Wernicke, and the period of Charcot. What Broca's discovery was we have seen. Wernicke was the first to discriminate those cases in which the patient cannot even understand speech from those in which he can understand, only not talk, and to ascribe the former condition to lesion of the temporal lobe. The condition in question is word deafness, and the disease, auditory aphasia. The latest statistical survey of the subject is that by Dr. Alan Starr. In the 7 cases of pure word deafness which he has collected, cases in 114, which the patient could read, talk, and write, but not understand what was said to him, the lesion was limited to the first and second temporal convolutions in their posterior 2/3. The lesion in right-handed, i.e., left-brained persons, is always on the left side, like the lesion in motor aphasia. Crude hearing would not be abolished, even were the left center for it utterly destroyed. The right center would still provide for that, but the linguistic use of hearing appears bound up with the integrity of the left center more or less exclusively. Here it must be that words heard enter into association with the things which they represent on the one hand, and with the movements necessary for pronouncing them on the other. In most of us, as Wernicke said, speech must go on from auditory cues, that is, our visual, tactile, and other ideas probably do not innervate our motor centers directly, but only after first arousing the mental sound of the words. This is the immediate stimulus to articulation, and where the possibility of this is abolished by the destruction of its usual channel in the left temporal lobe, the articulation must suffer. In the few cases in which the channel is abolished with no bad effect on speech, we must suppose an idiosyncrasy. The patient must innervate his speech organs either from the corresponding portion of the other hemisphere or directly from the centers of vision, touch, etc., with a leaning on the auditory region. It is the minute or analysis of such individual differences as these which constitutes Charcot's contribution towards clearing up the subject. Every nameable thing has numerous properties, qualities, or aspects. In our minds, the properties together with the name form an associated group. If different parts of the brain are severally concerned with the several properties, and a farther part with the hearing, and still another with the uttering of the name, there must inevitably be brought about, through the law of association which we shall later study, such a connection amongst all these brain parts that the activity of any one of them will be likely to awaken the activity of all the rest. When we are talking whilst we think, the ultimate process is utterance. If the brain part for that be injured, speech is impossible or disorderly, even though all the other brain parts be intact. And this is just the condition of things which, on page 109, we found to be brought about by lesion of the convolution of Broca. But back of that last act, various orders of succession are possible and associations of a talking man's ideas. The more usual orders, as aforesaid, from the tactile, visual, or other properties of the things thought about to the sound of their names, and then to the latter's utterance. But if in a certain individual's mind the look of an object or the look of its name be what habitually precedes articulation, then the loss of the hearing center will pro tanto not affect that individual's speech or reading. He will be mentally deafened. His understanding of the human voice will suffer, but he will not be aphasic. In this way it is possible to explain the 7 cases of word deafness without motor aphasia which figure in Dr. Starr's table. If this order of association be ingrained and habitual in that individual, injury to his visual centers will make him not only word blind, but aphasic as well. His speech will become confused in consequence of an occipital lesion. Consequently, plotting out on a diagram of the hemisphere of the 71 irreproachably reported cases of aphasia which he was able to collect, finds that the lesions concentrate themselves in 3 places. First, on Broca's center. Second, on Wernicke's third, on the supramarginal and angular convolutions under which those fibers pass which connect the visual centers with the rest of the brain. With this result, Dr. Starr's analysis of purely sensory cases agrees. In the chapter on imagination, we shall return to these differences in the sensory spheres of different individuals. Meanwhile, few things show more beautifully than the history of our knowledge of aphasia how the sagacity and patience of many banded workers are in time certain to analyze the darkest confusion into an orderly display. There is no organ of speech in the brain any more than there is a faculty of speech in the mind. The entire mind and the entire brain are more or less at work in a man who uses language. The Sudrent diagram from Ross shows the four parts most vitally concerned, and in the light of our text needs no farther explanation. Centers for smell, taste, and touch. The other sensory centers are less definitely made out. Smell and taste I will say nothing, and a muscular and cutaneous feeling only this, that it seems most probably seated in the motor zone, and possibly in the convolutions immediately backwards and midwards thereof. The incoming tactile currents must enter the cells of this region by one set of fibers, and the discharges leave them by another, but of these. Conclusion. We thus see the postulate of Maynard and Jackson, with which we started on p. 105, to be on the whole most satisfactorily corroborated by objective research. The highest centers do probably contain nothing but arrangements for representing impressions and movements, and other arrangements for coupling the activity of these arrangements together. Currents pouring in from the sense organs first excite some arrangements, which in turn excite others, until at last discharge downwards of some sort occurs. When this is once clearly grasped, there remains little ground for asking whether the motor zone is exclusively motor or sensitive as well. The whole cortex, inasmuch as currents run through it, is both. All the currents probably have feelings going with them, and sooner or later bring movements about. In one aspect, then, every center is afferent, in another efferent, even the motor cells of the spinal cord having these two aspects inseparably conjoined. Marique and Exner and Panat have shown that by cutting round a motor center and so separating it from the influence of the rest of the cortex, the same disorders are produced as by cutting it out, so that it is really just what I called it, only the funnel through which the stream of innervation, starting from elsewhere, escapes, a consciousness accompanying the stream, and being mainly of things seen if the stream is strongest occipitally, of things heard if it is strongest, temporally, of things felt, etc. If the stream occupies most intensely the motor zone, it seems to me that some broad and vague formulation like this is as much as we can safely venture on in the present state of science, so much at least is not likely to be overturned. But it is obvious how little this tells us of the detail of what goes on in the brain when a certain thought is before the mind. The general forms of relation perceived between things, as their identities, likenesses, or contrasts, are the forms of the consciousness itself, as effortless or perplexed, attentive or inattentive, pleasant or disagreeable, are the phenomena of interest and selection, etc., etc., are all lumped together as effects correlated with the currents that connect one center with another. Nothing can be more vague than such a formula. Moreover, certain portions of the brain, as the lower frontal lobes, escape formulation altogether. Their destruction gives rise to no local trouble of either motion or sensibility in dogs, and in monkeys neither stimulation nor excision of these lobes produces any symptoms whatever. One monkey of Horsley and Schieffer's was as tame, and did certain tricks as well after as before the operation. It is in short obvious that our knowledge of our mental states infinitely exceeds our knowledge of their concomitant cerebral conditions. Without introspective analysis of the mental elements of speech, the doctrine of aphasia, for instance, which is the most brilliant jewel in physiology, would have been utterly impossible. Our assumption that mind states are absolutely dependent on brain conditions must still be understood as a mere postulate. We may have a general faith that it must be true, but any exact insight as to how it is true lags woefully behind. Before taking up the study of conscious states, properly so called, I will in a separate chapter speak of 2 or 3 aspects of brain function which have a general importance and which cooperate in the production of all our mental states. This has been part 3 of Psych for Psychology's reading of Psychology, the book by William James. Thanks for listening.